All right, so as we continue to talk about sex determination in humans, it's important to realize that this process doesn't happen 100% accurately each and every time. So we can get some different syndromes that can result from either missing or additional copies of sex chromosomes. One of the first syndromes that we're going to talk about is Turner syndrome, and this is where an individual will actually just have one X chromosome and no second chromosome at all. So similar to the Drosophila, but in humans. So the genotype of these individuals actually ends up being XO, and O is just a placeholder for an absence of a second chromosome. These individuals tend to have very low hairlines, may have extra folds of hair or extra folds of skin on their neck, usually don't undergo puberty, and then they also have immature secondary sex characteristics such as breast enhancement, and then but they it doesn't this type of syndrome doesn't really affect um, intelligence at all or uh, mental um, mental advancement. So they usually have normal intellect. And as of today, there's no known cases um, of an OO chromosomal determination system. So usually those individuals are, if non-disjunction takes place and you actually don't receive a sex chromosome as part of the gamete, those individuals usually don't come to fruition during the fertilization process. So, but realize that Turner syndrome actually can happen pretty often. So 1 in 3,000 female births can actually be a Turner syndrome individual. A second individual that has some sort of issue with the sex chromosomes um, actually dispensing out and going through corrected meiosis or the corrected meiosis is Klinefelter syndrome, and this is where we see individuals that are genetically male but have an extra X chromosome, so they actually end up being XXY. And this happens even more frequently than Turner syndrome. This can happen in about 1 in 1,000 male births. And these individuals tend to have small testes. They will have a little bit of breast enlargement, reduction of facial hair. They tend to be very tall, but they're also end up being sterile. And as long as they only have 2 X chromosomes and 1 Y, they usually have very normal intellect. But as soon as you start adding more X chromosomes to the genotype, they can actually come or end up with mild and then severe forms of mental retardation. We also see a syndrome called poly-X syndrome, and this happens in females. And as you can see with the karyotype over here on this slide, this is where no Y chromosomes are present, but instead of the normal 2 X chromosomes, you actually get 3 X chromosomes. So this can happen pretty frequently as well, about 1 in 1,000 female births. And you may also hear this syndrome referred to as triplo X syndrome. These individuals tend to be very tall and thin. They have normal intelligence typically up until you start adding 4, 5, and 6 copies of the X chromosome. If individuals have 4 or 5 copies of the X chromosome, they tend to have some form of mental retardation. So the more X's that are present in their karyotype, the more severe the mental disability is. All right, and then the last syndrome that we can actually see occur is called Androgen-Insensitivity Syndrome. This relates directly back to the presence or the absence of the SRY gene on the Y chromosome. So individuals that have this androgen insensitivity syndrome, they actually have female external genitalia, but they fail to go through menses or menstruation. So these individuals are similar to like free Martin heifers that we see in the cattle species, to where they're actually exposed to, um, or where they actually have an incomplete reproductive tract. So these individuals on the human side will have a blind vagina, there, and then the uterus, oviduct, and ovaries are going to be absent. Within the abdominal cavity, actually, in these type of individuals, actually lies a pair of testes, and those testes are going to produce normal levels of testosterone that we see in males. So the individual is going to be phenotypically female and male, but she will be actually insensitive to androgens. Okay, so the gene is going to be the SRY gene on the X chromosome is going to actually um, be be present in this case because of the testes that were produced and are now producing testosterone. All right, so now we'll move on to some traits that are linked to to the two different sex chromosomes. Okay, so just some general points of interest about sex-linked traits. So first of all, the genes that are located on non-homologous regions are tend to be expressed without any sort of restriction. So they're either there or they're not there. There's no partial expression. Okay, so just keep in mind that sex-linked traits are really exposed because of the presence of sex-linked alleles. So you're going to see that as we work through a couple of problems. Sex-linked traits will produce distinct patterns of inheritance and in both males and females. So they aren't going to follow the typical um, 3-to-1 phenotypic ratio or a 9-3-3-1 phenotypic ratio that we saw in chapter 3, because these traits are only going to be expressed in a certain sex but may be carried by the opposite sex. We're going to see altering patterns of inheritance. And some traits that are linked to the sex chromosomes include hemophilia, red and green color blindness, congenital night blindness, hydrogen or high blood pressure, muscular dystrophy, and then the Fragile X syndrome. So this is Dr. Thomas Hunt Morgan, and he was one of the scientists that really discovered this concept of traits being linked to the sex chromosome, and he did that by identifying the sex-linked white eyes in Drosophila. So this was his fly laboratory, the fly room at Columbia University. So I'm very grateful for the labs that we now have. That had to be a lot of fun to work in. And what he and his team did was actually pose a question about, because they had noticed they had done observation studies and had noticed that some flies had red eyes and some flies had white eyes. So after sexing a bunch of flies, they actually asked the question and formed the hypothesis: are white eyes in fruit flies inherited as an autosomal but recessive trait? So the way that they tested this was they took a red-eyed female. So we know that she's female because she has two X chromosomes, and the cross or the plus sign codes for red eyes. So, and then they crossed her to a white-eyed male. So we know that this is a male because we have one X chromosome, one Y chromosome, and the W actually is codes for the white-eyed male trait in flies. So there's only one chromosome that can come from the female. It's going to be an X plus. But on the male side, that individual can actually produce or contribute one of two chromosomes to the offspring, either an XW or a Y. At the same, after they went through the results of the first study, the the research team actually did a reciprocal cross where they took a white-eyed female that was homozygous XW and crossed her with a red-eyed male that was had the genotype X plus Y. So out of both of those crosses, the first cross resulted in a red-eyed female. And it was crossed back to a red-eyed male. So after the individual chromosomes had gone through meiosis, then the female actually had the ability to pass on either an X plus or an XW gamete, whereas the male had the ability to pass on either an X plus or a Y gamete. In the reciprocal cross, that resulted in a female that was heterozygous, so X plus XW, and the white-eyed male actually had the phenotype of XWY. So as we look at the gametes that they were able to pass on, what the research team ended up determining was that in that F2 generation, we get half of the individuals that have red eyes in our female, a quarter of the individuals have red eyes and are male, and then a quarter of the males are also white-eyed. So they determined that this is an X-linked trait after they went back and did the reciprocal cross, where they actually had a 1-to-1 to 1-to-1 ratio of red-eyed females to white-eyed females to red-eyed males and white-eyed males. So the results of this study to the original question that they asked was that no, the results of the reciprocal cross are actually more consistent with X-linked inheritance rather than being a recessive trait. All right, so we're going to end this section here, and then we'll get back into some other sex-linked characteristics.